In the early years of World War II, as the flames of global conflict grew larger and more consuming, a small, once proud nation found itself caught between the two titanic forces of history, Nazi Germany and the Allied powers. The air was thick with fear, uncertainty, and a sense of impending doom. The soldiers of this nation, young men once full of idealism and patriotism, were now weary veterans of a brutal war. The horrors they had witnessed had chipped away at their innocence, and the innocent optimism they had once carried into battle had long since evaporated. Their faces were gaunt from hunger, their eyes hollow with exhaustion, and their spirits crushed under the weight of a conflict that seemed to stretch on forever. What had started as a fight for freedom and honor had devolved into a desperate struggle for survival, and each day seemed to bring with it another reminder of their dwindling chances. The once proud military apparatus of this small nation had been battered by the relentless advance of Nazi forces, leaving behind nothing but a broken, disillusioned army. The soldiers had been pushed to the brink of collapse, both physically and mentally. They had marched through hell, wading through mud, trudging through freezing cold, enduring starvation and disease, all the while watching their comrades fall, one by one. Their supply lines had been severed, and ammunition was running low. The weapons they once depended on were either broken or obsolete. Their leaders, once symbols of strength and resolve, had become shadowy figures, torn between surrender and continuing the fight. The decision to resist, to push forward, had begun to feel like a fool's errand. For these men, the idea of victory had long since become a distant memory. The enemy, the Germans, had shown no mercy in their advance, crushing everything in their path, leaving only devastation and death behind. To the soldiers, their very existence felt like a tragedy unfolding in real time. The world, they believed, expected nothing more from them than their inevitable demise. Their country was on the brink of collapse, its capital surrounded, its cities reduced to rubble. The soldiers, caught in the heart of this nightmare, had lost all hope of triumph. All that remained was the dread of what would come next. They expected punishment, not the swift justice of a noble defeat, but a brutal reckoning for their failure to defend their land, for their weakness in the face of a relentless enemy. This expectation of punishment became a consuming thought, gnawing at their minds day and night. It wasn't just fear of physical pain that haunted them, but the psychological weight of knowing that they had failed. They had been trained to be warriors, to fight for honor and glory, to defend their people. But now, stripped of their strength, stripped of their ability to resist, they could not help but feel as though they had betrayed everything they had once believed in. Their failure was not only a personal one, it felt as though they had failed their entire nation. The weight of this shame was almost unbearable. They had seen their comrades die in battle, their bodies scattered across the landscape like broken toys. The idea that they would soon join them, that their own lives would end in such a meaningless way, seemed almost fitting. There was a cruel irony to their situation. The very thing they had been taught to fear, defeat, had become the inevitable end of their journey. They had always believed that the only way to regain their dignity was through victory, but victory had slipped beyond their grasp, a fleeting dream that now seemed hopelessly out of reach. And yet, in this final moment, when all seemed lost, they still held on to the belief that there must be some form of justice, some form of reckoning that would make sense of their suffering. In their minds, the punishment for their failure was inevitable. They had no delusions about it. The only question that remained was what form that punishment would take. As the days dragged on, a sense of dread began to settle over the soldiers like a heavy fog. They could feel the end drawing near, and with it came the certainty of their fate. The enemy was closing in, and there would be no escape. Their leaders, who had once spoken of glorious victories and patriotic duty, now spoke in somber tones, preparing the men for the inevitable. Surrender seemed to be the only option left, though it was a bitter pill to swallow. But what choice did they have? To fight on would mean certain death, and to surrender might mean the same, but at least it would offer a chance, however small, for survival. The soldiers, disillusioned and broken, accepted the harsh reality. They were no longer in control of their own destinies. In the final days of their retreat, the soldiers made their way toward the British lines, their hearts heavy with a mixture of fear and resignation. They knew what awaited them. The British, they had been taught to believe, were no better than their Nazi enemies. They had heard the stories of brutal reprisals and executions, of the harsh treatment of prisoners of war. The soldiers expected nothing less than cruelty from their captors. They imagined their fate would be a swift and violent one, perhaps a firing squad, perhaps worse. The prospect of living as prisoners of war was unthinkable to them. They had been taught that such an existence was worse than death itself. And yet, what choice did they have? As they approached the British lines, the soldiers braced themselves for the inevitable. They could already hear the sounds of battle in the distance, the rumble of tanks and the crackle of gunfire. But there was something strange about the way the British forces greeted them. They had expected a cold reception, a swift and merciless punishment for their weakness. But instead, the soldiers were met with silence, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching. The British soldiers, who they had once seen as the enemy, now stood before them, eyes wary but not hostile. They did not raise their weapons. They did not shout orders or make demands. Instead, they simply observed the defeated men before them. It was as though they were waiting for something, though none of the soldiers could tell what. In that moment, a strange thought crossed the minds of the men. The British were not as they had imagined them to be. They had expected harshness, cruelty, and anger. But instead, the British seemed patient. There was no judgment in their eyes, no condemnation. For the first time in months, the soldiers found themselves questioning everything they had been taught about their enemies. In the face of certain defeat, they had expected the worst, but what they were receiving was something far more perplexing, something they were unprepared for. This moment, quiet and unsettling, would become a turning point for the soldiers. In their darkest hour, when they had expected nothing but punishment, they were instead confronted with something entirely unexpected: patience. It was the first crack in the foundation of their worldview, and it would set the stage for everything that was to come. They had expected retribution, but instead they were met with the space to reflect, to rest, and to heal, a gift they had not anticipated, and one that would change their perception of both their captors and the war itself. The moment of surrender arrived quietly, like a distant storm finally breaking over a parched land. The soldiers had spent days, even weeks, retreating from the advancing enemy, their feet dragging through mud-soaked earth, their minds clouded by exhaustion and fear. The weight of their journey had worn them down to their barest essence, stripped of hope, strength, and resolve. Each day, as the sky grew darker and the horizon seemed to close in around them, they were forced to confront the terrible truth: they could no longer continue the fight. The enemy's forces, relentless and organized, had surrounded their position. The once formidable defensive lines had been shattered, and their ability to maneuver, to resist, was no more. What remained was the bitter realization that defeat was inevitable. As the soldiers stood on the precipice of that final decision, the sounds of the war seemed to fade away, replaced by an eerie silence. The gunfire and explosions, which had once filled the air with a constant cacophony of violence, now felt distant, almost unreal. It was as though time itself had stopped, holding its breath in anticipation of the choice they were about to make. Would they continue to resist, knowing full well that it would lead to their annihilation? Or would they lay down their arms, abandon the fight, and face whatever awaited them on the other side? The choice was not an easy one. Each man carried the weight of his own fears, doubts, and hopes. For some, surrender was anathema, a betrayal of everything they had been taught to believe in, a stain on their honor that could never be washed away. They had been trained to fight until the very end, to never give up, no matter the cost. The thought of surrender felt like a betrayal to their comrades who had already fallen, to their families who had sent them off with pride and hope. It was a betrayal of the ideals they had been raised to uphold: bravery, sacrifice, and national pride. The very idea of raising a white flag, of admitting defeat, seemed incomprehensible. And yet, as the days wore on and the soldiers saw their comrades die one by one, they realized that the fight was no longer about winning. It was about survival. For others, surrender was not a question of honor but of survival. They had seen the horrors of battle, the mangled bodies of their comrades, the blood-soaked earth, the smoke of burning villages rising into the sky. The cost of resistance had become too high, and the thought of facing the enemy in another hopeless battle seemed pointless. The soldiers knew that they were not fighting for any great cause anymore. They were simply trying to stay alive, to escape the grinding machine of war that threatened to consume them all. And so, the decision became easier for them. Surrender, they thought, might be their only hope for survival. The British soldiers, they reasoned, might show them mercy. At the very least, they might offer them food, rest, and the chance to heal. As the decision was made, the soldiers reluctantly began to lower their weapons. It was a strange, almost surreal moment. For so long, the rifle had been an extension of themselves, a symbol of their strength, their defiance. To release it, to set it down on the ground, felt like an irreversible act, an admission that they had failed, that they had been beaten. The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, as if each one was searching for reassurance in the eyes of the others. But there was no comfort to be found. The truth had already set in. They were no longer fighters. They were prisoners, and their fate was now in the hands of the enemy. As they walked toward the British lines, the weight of surrender pressed down on them like a physical burden. Every step felt like a journey toward their doom, as if the ground beneath their feet was made of stone. They had no illusions about what awaited them. Their minds were filled with images of execution squads, of long marches to prison camps, of torture and mistreatment. They had heard the rumors, the stories of prisoners being starved, beaten, and forced to endure unimaginable hardships. The fear of the unknown gnawed at them, but it was tempered by the knowledge that death, at least, would be swift. Surrender, they believed, meant the end of their suffering, but only if it was a quick death. If it was not, they would face a slow, agonizing fate that would stretch on for years. The closer they came to the British lines, the more the soldiers' minds began to race. Some wondered whether they had made the right choice. Had they abandoned their comrades? Had they given up too soon? Others wondered whether they would be treated with any humanity at all. Would the British see them as victims of the war, as fellow human beings, or would they view them as enemies to be crushed? The uncertainty of what awaited them was the cruelest part of the whole ordeal. They had no idea what the British forces thought of them. To them, they were just another group of defeated soldiers, the remnants of a broken army. As they finally reached the British lines, the soldiers were met with a strange, almost disconcerting calm. They had expected shouts of triumph, angry demands, perhaps even the cold barrels of rifles pointed at them. Instead, they found British soldiers who simply stood there, watching them with wary eyes but not raising their weapons. There was no fury, no judgment in the air, only silence. The men who had surrendered expected to be met with condemnation, but instead, they were met with an almost disinterested quiet. The British soldiers seemed to have no interest in their surrender, as if it was nothing more than a routine event. They were not enemies to be destroyed, but simply men who had given up the fight. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. The soldiers who had surrendered could not understand it. They had expected hate, but they were met with indifference. The British soldiers did not rush to take their weapons or bind them with ropes. They did not shout or make demands. They simply watched, as if waiting for something, but what that something was, no one knew. The waiting became unbearable. The soldiers who had surrendered exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. Were they free to go? Should they stand at attention, or should they kneel before their captors? No one knew the proper protocol for such a moment. It was then that something unexpected happened. The British soldiers, after what felt like an eternity of silence, began to move. But instead of dragging them away to a camp, instead of shouting orders or showing any sign of hostility, they simply gestured for the surrendered men to follow them. The soldiers who had expected violence were now being led, not toward a prison, but toward a place of rest. The men who had anticipated torture and humiliation were instead being offered something far more perplexing: patience. The British soldiers moved with a calm assurance, as though they were in no hurry, as though they had all the time in the world. The surrendered soldiers, still on edge, followed them cautiously, unsure of what to expect. But as they walked, the tension in their bodies began to loosen, if only slightly. There was no brutality here, no retribution, just a quiet sense of control. In the days that followed, the soldiers who had surrendered began to realize that their captors, the British, were not what they had expected. The mercy they had anticipated in their minds was not an act of weakness, but of strange, inscrutable strength. They had expected punishment, but instead they were given time. Time to rest, to recover, to reflect. The British forces did not treat them as less than human, but as men caught in a terrible war, just as they had been. This unexpected patience, this quiet restraint, began to slowly unravel the soldiers' preconceived notions about their captors. The British were not the merciless enemies they had been taught to fear. In fact, they were something far more complex, a force not of retribution, but of endurance, of discipline, of patience. The soldiers who had expected punishment for their weakness now found themselves in the midst of an entirely new and unexpected experience, the chance to heal, to breathe, and to reconsider everything they had once believed about war, honor, and survival. As the days stretched on in captivity, the soldiers, once bound by the harsh rhythms of battle, found themselves cast into a new reality. The war, with all its frenzy and violence, seemed distant, reduced to a memory rather than an ever-present storm. They awoke each day to the same bewildering routine, the steady march of time, the cold, gray sky above, and the quiet, almost oppressive calm that hung in the air. They had expected their time as prisoners to be filled with hatred, with fear, with the crushing weight of their own failure. Yet, there was something different in the way the British soldiers treated them, something that unsettled them in ways they were not prepared for. Instead of cold commands and hostile glares, they were met with a surprising sense of patience. This was not the treatment of defeated enemies, but of men caught in the same tragic maelstrom that they themselves had been victims of. For the first time in months, the soldiers began to sleep through the night without waking in a cold sweat, without the constant terror of incoming artillery fire or the fear of falling asleep to the sound of their comrades' screams. The British provided them with food, albeit simple and basic, but it was a small luxury that they had almost forgotten existed. They were given blankets, though thin and rough, they offered warmth, something they had not felt in so long. The soldiers, at first confused and wary, soon began to allow themselves the rare indulgence of rest. The human body, starved for sustenance, aching with fatigue, began to remember what it felt like to recover. Their minds, clouded by the relentless pressure of war, began to clear in the calm that the British brought. And yet, despite this unexpected reprieve, a sense of unease lingered. The men were prisoners, after all. They had surrendered, admitting their weakness in the face of overwhelming force. Though they had been spared immediate punishment, there was still the unspoken knowledge that their fate was not entirely in their hands. They lived each day in the shadow of uncertainty, unsure of when their status as prisoners might evolve into something worse. They were trapped, caught between the terror of what they had feared and the uneasy reality of the present. Even the patience they were shown felt like a double-edged sword. It was as if the British were waiting for something, withholding judgment or action for a reason they could not understand. In the quiet moments, when they were left to themselves, the soldiers would often gather in small groups, talking in hushed voices. Some of them clung to their memories of home, holding on to the hope that someday they might return to the places they had once known, to the families they had once held dear. Others had resigned themselves to their fate. The war had stolen too much from them. Their hearts had been hardened by the years of violence and loss. They had come to believe that home was an illusion, a place that no longer existed. They had been transformed by the war into something else, something distant from the men they had once been. And so, they found solace in the simple things, the smell of fresh bread, the warmth of a fire, the sight of a fellow soldier smiling at something as mundane as a bird in the trees. These small moments, so fleeting and insignificant, became treasures, brief flashes of a life they had lost but had not yet given up on reclaiming. And yet, as the days wore on, their bodies and minds began to heal in ways that were not just physical. The process was gradual, almost imperceptible, but it was happening. They started to see their captors differently, not as the faceless enemy they had once imagined, but as human beings with their own burdens to carry. The British soldiers, despite being their captors, were not monsters. They did not mock them, did not taunt them for their defeat. They did not gloat over the prisoners' fall, nor did they treat them as inferior beings. Instead, they performed their duties with a quiet professionalism, not as conquerors, but as men simply doing a job. There was a sense of restraint in their every movement, a deliberate calmness in their words and actions that both confused and intrigued the prisoners. For the first time, the soldiers found themselves questioning everything they had been taught about their enemies. They began to speak to the British soldiers, tentatively at first, but then with more confidence. The conversations were simple at first, questions about the weather, about the food they had been given, about the names of the towns nearby. But as they began to recover, as their minds slowly began to function again after months of mental exhaustion, the conversations grew deeper. They began to talk about their families, about their homes, about the lives they had lived before the war. The British soldiers, in turn, began to share their own stories. They spoke of their own losses, their own suffering, their own families who waited for them to return home. Slowly, the soldiers began to realize that they had far more in common with their captors than they had ever imagined. They were not so different after all. Both sides had been torn apart by the war, both had seen loved ones lost, both had witnessed the destruction of everything they had once believed in. In those conversations, a strange sense of kinship began to form. It was as though, through their shared experiences, the walls that had once separated them, the walls of nationality, of enemy lines, of ideology, began to dissolve. They had both been caught in the same brutal machine, ground down by the same relentless forces of violence and hatred. They were, in essence, victims of the same war. For the soldiers who had surrendered, this realization was both humbling and disorienting. They had been taught to hate the British, to see them as an enemy to be crushed. Yet here they were, sitting together, sharing stories, laughing at jokes, talking about their hopes for the future. It was as if the war had forged a new kind of bond, a bond born not of shared victories, but of shared suffering. And it was in this shared suffering that the soldiers began to glimpse something they had never expected, the possibility of reconciliation. It was not a notion they had considered before. They had grown up in a world where enemies were just that, enemies, to be destroyed without question. But now, in the quiet moments of reflection, they saw that the war had made no true distinctions between them and the British soldiers. They were all, in the end, victims of the same tragedy. As the days passed, and as they came to understand each other more deeply, the soldiers began to feel an unfamiliar sensation, gratitude. They were grateful for the food they had been given, for the opportunity to rest, for the chance to heal. But more than that, they were grateful for the chance to see the British soldiers not as enemies, but as human beings, just like themselves. This shift in perspective was not immediate, nor was it without its complications. There were still moments of tension, moments when old fears and old hatreds would flare up. There were still soldiers who could not reconcile the reality of their captivity with the notion of shared humanity. But as time passed, as the soldiers continued to heal, the divisions between them and their captors began to blur. They began to see the futility of the war more clearly, not just the futility of their own defeat, but the futility of the conflict itself. What had it all been for? The hatred, the bloodshed, the loss of life, none of it had brought them closer to victory, to peace, or to any kind of lasting resolution. It had only brought destruction. The soldiers, in their newfound clarity, began to question the very nature of war itself. They had come to believe that strength lay in the ability to conquer, to defeat, to destroy. But now they saw that true strength lay not in these things, but in the ability to endure, to show mercy, and to allow time for healing. The patience that the British soldiers had shown them was not weakness, as they had once believed. It was, in fact, the strongest form of resilience. The British had given them time, not just to recover physically, but to reflect, to reconsider their beliefs, and to reconsider their place in the world. It was an act of mercy they had never expected, and one that would stay with them forever. The soldiers, now beginning to understand the true nature of their captivity, found themselves filled with a sense of hope that, one day, they could rebuild not just their country, but their very understanding of what it meant to be human. The war had not only scarred their bodies and minds, it had altered the very essence of who they were. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was still time to heal. The The soldiers, having spent countless weeks in captivity, began to undergo a slow but undeniable transformation. It wasn't just their bodies that were recovering, nourished by food and rest. It was something deeper, something more intangible that was changing within them. When they had first been captured, they had expected to be treated as enemies, to be crushed beneath the weight of their defeat, but what they received instead was something they had not anticipated, a strange kind of patience from their captors. The British soldiers, their supposed adversaries, had treated them not with hostility, but with quiet restraint. There was a calmness in their actions, a deliberateness in their approach to their prisoners that made the men wonder, with growing unease, whether they were being held by enemies at all. It was in this dissonance, between what they expected and what they were given, that the seeds of doubt began to sprout. At first, the soldiers could not comprehend the lack of urgency in their British captors' treatment of them. After all, they had been raised on stories of cruel and unforgiving enemies, of foes who sought nothing but the destruction of everything they stood for. They had been trained to hate the British, to view them as a distant and uncaring force who, like their Nazi counterparts, would show no mercy. And yet, day after day, the British soldiers did nothing to fulfill that expectation. They did not torment them. They did not mock them. They did not see their surrender as an opportunity for cruelty. They treated the men with a startling level of civility, as though they were not enemies to be broken, but simply prisoners, men who had fallen victim to a larger, tragic fate, much like themselves. The first few days were filled with confusion. The soldiers who had surrendered, now held behind the barbed wire and guarded by men they once thought of as their enemies, had no idea what to make of their new situation. It was almost as if time had frozen, and they were caught in an in-between space. Their former lives, their national pride, their loyalty to their country, all seemed irrelevant now. They had been torn from their world and placed in a strange new one where the rules of engagement no longer seemed to apply. They no longer wore uniforms of pride, but the ragged clothes of prisoners. Their status as soldiers was stripped from them, replaced with the grim reality of their captivity. Yet, strangely, none of their captors seemed to view them with the same malice they had imagined. The British did not rush to make them feel inferior, did not constantly remind them of their surrender, of their failure. They did not gloat. Instead, the soldiers were treated with a degree of respect they were not prepared for. They were allowed to rest, given food to eat, and were even given time to talk, to reflect, to regain some semblance of their former selves. As the days turned into weeks, the soldiers began to notice the subtle shift within themselves. Their physical wounds, inflicted by the cruel hands of war, began to heal, but it was their mental wounds, those unseen scars, that took longer to mend. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were given space to breathe, to think, and to let the trauma of war fade, even if just for a brief moment. Their minds, once consumed by the insatiable hunger for victory or vengeance, were slowly becoming less clouded by anger and hatred. The very things that had motivated them to fight, pride, honor, loyalty, were now questioned by the slow, undeniable realization that the war itself had been one of pointless destruction. They had lost so much, and for what? A cause that had become increasingly difficult to justify. The soldiers had spent so long fighting for an ideal that now seemed distant and hollow. They had been told that victory was the only path to redemption, that their strength as men and as soldiers lay in their ability to fight to the bitter end. But now, in the face of defeat, they found themselves wondering if the true path to redemption lay not in fighting, but in healing. There was a profound discomfort in the air, something that none of them could name. The British soldiers who had captured them did not speak often of the war. They did not discuss the politics of it, the grand strategies, the reasons for fighting. They simply went about their duties with a quiet efficiency that made the prisoners realize, with mounting discomfort, that the British had long ago accepted something the prisoners had not yet come to terms with, that the war would not be won by the strength of arms alone. It was a battle for survival, not for glory. The British soldiers understood that the real strength was not in victory, but in endurance, in patience, in the ability to wait out the chaos and the violence until the war finally exhausted itself. This understanding was what set them apart, and it was a lesson that the soldiers, once so full of pride and nationalistic fervor, slowly began to absorb. As the days passed, the conversations between the prisoners and their captors grew more frequent. It began with small talk about trivial matters like the weather, the state of the food, and the mundane realities of their daily lives. But slowly, the barriers began to fall. The prisoners, once so filled with distrust and hatred for their captors, started to ask questions. They asked about their families, their lives back home, about the lives the British soldiers had led before the war. It became apparent that the British soldiers, too, were not simply products of a foreign machine. They were men who had their own hopes and dreams, who had their own losses and griefs. Slowly, over time, the walls between captor and captive began to crumble, replaced by the raw, shared understanding of the human condition. These were not faceless enemies. These were men, like themselves, caught in the same tragedy. What emerged from these conversations was an uncomfortable yet liberating realization that their enemies were, in many ways, the same as they were. They had all been swept up in a global conflict that no one had fully understood. They had all been told to fight for causes that, in the end, felt increasingly meaningless. What began as an ideological battle had become a brutal, soul-crushing war, fought by men who did not truly understand why they were fighting, or if their sacrifices would ever lead to anything. In the quiet moments, the soldiers who had surrendered began to realize that their British captors were not the enemy they had imagined them to be. They were fellow human beings, trying to make sense of a world torn apart by the madness of war. The very things they had been taught to fear, the British, their so-called enemies, were, in the end, just like them. For the soldiers, this realization was unsettling. It was easier to hate, easier to view their enemies as less than human. It was easier to believe that their suffering was a result of an external force, an enemy that could be vanquished through sheer willpower. But the truth, as it began to settle in, was far more complicated. The war had shown them that enemies were not easily defined, that the lines between right and wrong, between good and evil, were often blurred beyond recognition. The British soldiers who guarded them had not acted out of a desire for vengeance. They had not sought to destroy their captives. Instead, they had treated them with a quiet patience, a strange kindness that, over time, revealed the depths of their strength. It was a form of power the soldiers had not understood before, the power of restraint, of waiting, of enduring. It was a strength that did not seek to dominate, but to allow for growth and healing. As the weeks passed, the soldiers found themselves in a state of deep reflection. Their bodies had recovered, their minds were clearer, and they were beginning to see the war in a different light. What had once seemed like a heroic battle for survival now seemed like a senseless waste. They had been pawns in a larger game, caught between forces that had little regard for their lives. The very things they had been taught to believe, honor, loyalty, pride, now seemed to have no real meaning. In the face of such senseless destruction, they began to understand that strength did not lie in winning, but in surviving, in enduring, and in finding a way to heal. The British, in their patient silence, had shown them something they had never expected, a way out of the endless cycle of violence. Through restraint, through compassion, they had demonstrated a form of strength the soldiers had not understood before. It was a lesson that would change them forever. The soldiers who had once believed that victory could only be achieved through force now understood that true power lay in the ability to endure, to heal, and to forgive. And as they sat in their captivity, day after day, reflecting on what had been lost, they began to see that their captors had given them something far more valuable than freedom. They had given them the chance to heal, to grow, and to learn the true meaning of strength. The days turned to weeks, and then to months, as the soldiers continued their life under British captivity. At first, the experience had been disorienting, uncomfortable, even deeply unsettling. They had come to expect punishment for their surrender, to be treated as the worst of failures. Their pride, once unshakable, had been shattered by the overwhelming force of the enemy, and the heavy weight of their surrender made them feel smaller than they ever had before. The British had seemed like distant figures of power, a force they had been taught to hate and fear. Now, in the shadow of their defeat, they were forced to confront a reality that was alien to everything they had been taught to believe. Instead of the brutal discipline and swift punishment they had expected, they found themselves in a strange limbo. In the early days of captivity, The soldiers had found little comfort in their new lives. They were still haunted by memories of battle, the screams of dying comrades echoing in their ears. The shock of surrender, the final act of acknowledging their defeat, had left an indelible mark on them. They had been trained to fight to the death, to stand tall in the face of any enemy, and the very idea of giving up seemed unthinkable. Yet, as the days went on, they began to adjust to the reality of captivity. They were given food, basic, but nourishing, and clean water. They were not mistreated or humiliated as they had feared. They were not thrown into cramped, overcrowded cells, nor were they subjected to beatings or torture. Instead, they were given the time to rest, to recover, and, most surprisingly of all, to reflect. What happened in that quiet time, those long days filled with stillness, was something they had never expected: healing. At first, it was small. They began to sleep through the night without waking up in terror, without hearing the distant rumble of artillery or the screams of the dying. Their bodies, so worn and weathered by the ravages of war, slowly started to regain strength. They were no longer living in the shadow of battle, and for the first time in months, they felt the comfort of warmth and rest. But what was even more surprising was the mental transformation that took place.